Hi, I'm Anna Elizabeth Drager for Bead and Button Magazine. To thread your loom, you're going to work with the thread still on the spool. And what I've done is I've just made a loop at the very end of the thread, just an overhand loop. And you're going to loop it around the hook or screw that's on one end of your loom. Most looms will have at least one, if not more, depending on how big the loom is. You're going to bring the thread across the loom to the corresponding sets of coils on the other side, wrap around the hook, and go through the next coil and across, and back around the hook on this end. And you're going to continue in that fashion until you have one more warp thread than your pattern calls for. Now, if you are using bigger beads, you can skip a coil in the loom so it leaves a bigger space, or if you're using different size beads within the same pattern. But normally you'll just be using the same size bead. If you want to make a longer strip of beadwork, what I've done is I've cut 2-yard pieces of thread and folded them in half, and at the top just made an overhand knot so there was a loop. And what I'm going to do is hook that around the top of my loom, and then the adjustable loom, you can roll this until you have most of it on the roll. And then you're going to want to take one warp thread and place it in the coil and bring it across. And you're going to do that with each thread. And holding that in place with your thumb, you're just going to wrap these tails around the screw on the other end, or the hook on the other end. Temporarily fasten them to the loom. And then as you're working, you can loosen these screws and let more warp threads out as you go. So you would tighten it on one end and loosen it on the other, and just slide it down as you work. When you get the proper number of warps completed, you're just going to wrap this thread around the hook on the one end and trim the wire. Keep holding this tight so that it doesn't loosen up the warp threads, and then just secure it temporarily with a piece of tape. Then you want to work with a comfortable length of thread, maybe 1 or 2 yards at a time. You don't want to have too much thread at one time. It'll get tangled up, and you have to add thread usually on any loom project. Tie your thread to the first warp thread, and you want to leave a little bit of a tail so that you can tie that in later. It doesn't have to, it just is an overhand knot. You don't want it to be too tight. And then you're going to bring the thread underneath the loom. And you're going to string as many beads as the spaces between the warp threads. If you're working from a pattern, you're going to read the pattern from left to right, because when you pull the beads up to the warp threads here, they go from the left to the right. And then you're going to push the beads up between each set of warp threads. And sometimes this takes a little finesse, but as soon as you get the first row established, the subsequent rows are much easier. And you're going to pull the weft thread over the top of the beads. And I'll just do that again. When you pull the thread underneath the warp threads here, it's sitting on the bottom of the threads. And then when you sew back through the beads, you want that thread to be sitting on top of the threads. And you can see your needle as you pull it through. You can kind of see the gleam of the needle over the top of the threads, and that's good to see. And you don't want to pull too tight because you don't want the ends to buckle. But then you just continue in that manner until you've completed your pattern or you reach the desired length. When you achieve your desired number of rows, or you complete your pattern, You're going to stitch back through the last several rows of beads. And at this point, it doesn't matter if it's on top or the bottom of the warp threads. It's just to secure the thread. Then you're going to just sew through the first few beads in a row. And you want to sew underneath one of the warp threads. And when you pull the thread through, it's going to make a small loop, and you're going to just make a half hitch knot in between those two beads next to that one warp thread. And you can continue through the row, repeating that a few times. When you complete the last knot, just sew through a few beads, and then you can trim that thread off. And you just repeat with this other tail. When you finish tying off the beginning and the end tail, you're going to remove the warp threads from the loom. So you want to remove the tape that's holding the tail down. And you can cut this right here. On this particular loom, I can just pull this peg out, and it makes it easy to remove that. And on this sample, these threads are not very long. Usually you would want to have about 8 inches of thread to work with to tie the tails in. It just makes it easier. You're going to start with the first warp thread. And you're going to thread your needle on there. And you just want to sew into the first bead or 2 beads. And then you want to sew back through the 2 beads in the previous row. And this is just going to lock that thread into place and hold those beads where you want them. And sew through the next 3 beads. And then drop down to the next row and sew back through 2 beads. And then what I like to do is move away from these end 2 rows because they're going to get packed up with thread if you stay right there, and just weave away from those 2 end rows. And the thread will be hidden between the 2 rows of beads that you're sewing through. When you get far enough away from those rows, you can do the same thing to end your tails, which is to sew underneath one of the warp threads in between 2 beads and start making that loop to make that little half hitch between 2 beads, and then continue through the row. Now you're going to continue that with each of these warp threads, and because of the way mine came off the loom, it had a loop on each end. You would just simply cut those if you have the same type of loom set up, and go ahead and move to the next warp thread.